Hello, welcome to another event in our project Art and Politics. The starting point of the project was the exhibition in the renowned Struktura Gallery in Sofia with the etching cycle The War by Octet from the IFA collection, which Maria Vasileva exhibits together with works by Hannah Hösch, Goethe, Ucker, Gerhard Richter, and Joseph Beuys, and with a new installation by the Bulgarian artist Antoni Rajikov. The common denominator of the exhibition and our project, Art and Politics, is the question, basically, which role we want to give art in society. We started the series with a lecture by Wiebke Trunk about orthotics and other positions of art as resistance against political power. And we continue now with two lectures by Bojana Kunst Boyan Manchev, and afterwards with a conversation between them. In the evening, we will have the privilege to assist a performance by the Bulgarian artist Boyan Boyan. And on December 5th, we will close the series with a lecture by Catherine Nichols about Joseph Beuys. I do not want to miss to mention the series of workshops with 13 artists and curators led by Vuceza Bujagiev. And we would like to thank everyone who has already participated in this fruitful exchange. But now I am very happy to present to you Boyan Manchev and Bojana Kunst. Boyan Manchev is a philosopher and writer. He is professor of philosophy at the New Bulgarian University and guest professor at the University of Arts Berlin. He is also former director of program and vice president of the International College of Philosophy in Paris. And he's the author of 15 books, which I won't list all now. Boyan Manchev contributed as author, theorist, dramaturg, actor and curator to visual arts, theater, cinema, and contemporary dance projects. The search for new possibilities of philosophical, aesthetic, and political experience has been central to his work in the past 25 years. Bojana Kunst is a philosopher, dramaturg, and performance theoretician as well. She works as a professor at the Institute for Applied Theater Studies in Justus Liebig University Gießen, where she is leading an international master program, choreography and performance. She worked as a researcher at the University of Ljubljana and University of Antwerp, and later as a guest professor at the University of Hamburg. Her research interest is contemporary performance and dance, arts, theory and philosophy of contemporary art. Her last book is Artist at Work, Proximity of Art and Capitalism, which I found very interesting for our context. And this was why we invited Bojana Kunst to come to Sofia. Unfortunately, the pandemic made this impossible. But I am very happy that we have the chance to meet her virtually. But now we will start with a lecture by Boyan Manchev. Welcome, and Boyan, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, and thank you very much, Marina. It's a great pleasure and an honor to talk at this forum or at this series of events connected to the project Art and Politics. And before I start, I would like to thank you, Marina and Stefka, as well as Vuceza, for this brilliant organization in these really difficult times. And I would like also to say that I'm really glad that we, not only by sort of an obvious onomastic connection, but also because of 20 years long friendship and conversation with Bojana, we have the chance to once more discuss issues that are very much at stake in the current debate. And today I will start with a proposal that it is rather sort of a provocative statement in order to launch the discussion, to open a discussion. Yesterday evening, I had a closed seminar with the participants in this series, where I presented a much more philosophical and more systematic, abstract approach on the relation between art and politics. And now I will introduce this kind of a very specific perspective connected to a question which I think is very much at the core of the connection between art and politics, because it deals with the paradigmatic, so to say, frame of, or paradigmatic axis of this connection between art and politics in modern times, which is the, I would say, the structural moment of the revolution. The revolutionary practice in politics and in art, where I think, let's say, the overlapping, if not the identification of artistic and political practices becomes dominant. And while yesterday I introduced a broad historical perspective talking about the French Revolution, the Soviet revolutions in Russia, but also in Europe, in Bavaria, etc. Today, I will focus on a moment which we, in a way, celebrated recently. But what does it mean to celebrate it when we see that it is a sort of a failed project of a revolution? Of course, I mean 1968, half a century and 2 years ago, events that became, in a way, paradigmatic for the reflection on the connection between art and politics in the last decades. And I will introduce my topic and the short abstract that I propose, because it is a sort of a allegorical figure or allegorical proposal that I'm going to articulate further in my talk. So the title is Melancholy and Obsession, the Revolution and its Double. In the aftermath of the failed revolution, hordes of revengeful, disillusioned ghosts are roaming around the streets. They are also invading galleries and theater halls. They immigrate back to the shelter of bourgeois cultural institutions. This is the melancholic drive of the revolutionary art. What about the obsessed ones, those who, possessed by exuberant fantasies, do not want to surrender and continue instead to wander under the influence of the ardent stars? My allegory implies a preliminary typology of radical arts practices in face of the failure of radical political projects. I will focus on the striking example of what I would describe as melancholic reduction and confront it with examples of obsessive radical artistic practices persisting in the last decades. So this short lecture will not aim to provide an answer to the radical question, is radical art still possible? It will tackle instead the conditions of its possibility, the current transformations of its politics of use, and of the production of its surplus value. It will imagine a new effectivity of the affective forms of art. And I'll immediately start with two privileged examples. Yesterday, I spoke about few trends or few forms of radical art in the period of '68, which precisely tend to blur the relationship between art and politics, or rather to think of artistic practice or of artistic forms as genuine political forms. So basically, to paraphrase a famous sentence, art is politics done by other ways. And in that sense, I'll take the paradigmatic example of French situationists who precisely consider themselves as political makers, of political doers, not activists, but as genuine political agents, as genuine political subjects. And I just remind you that they were not calling themselves situationists, they were calling themselves members of the L'Internationale Situationniste, obviously the Situationist International, which is built upon the model of the Communist International. And I won't go back to what I introduced last night, namely the situationist idea of situation as opposed to the concept of spectacle, what they were calling the level of accumulation of capital in which it acquires the intensity of an image. This is a quote by La Société du Spectacle by Guy Debord. But I'm rather going to talk about what happens after 68, what happens after this kind of a revolutionary moment, this revolutionary situation, if you like. And here maybe is, before I speak, what happens is the moment to introduce a quote by one of the philosophers who was in the streets in 68, because not all philosophers, not all, let's say, the most influential voices of the philosophy were in the streets at that moment. This is the reason why there is a famous graffiti saying the structures are not on the streets. And this is a direct criticism to not only Lévi-Strauss or Jacques Lacan, but also to Michel Foucault and other extremely influential left critical philosophers who kind of were skeptical about what happened in 68. But instead, there were also a very direct influence coming from philosophers. Maybe the direct, let's say, instigator of 68 movement was the philosopher Henri Lefebvre. But I'm going to speak of, or to quote another philosopher who is quite famous, but not necessarily through his relation to the events of 68. This is the enigmatic French philosopher Maurice Blanchot. And I'll quote him first in French and I'll translate. So he says in a late book, La communauté inavouable the unconfessed, unavowed community. I think it's the translation in English. He says the following: La révolution est derrière nous, objet de consommation et parfois de jouissance. Mais ce qui est devant nous, ce qui sera terrible, n'a pas encore de nom. So he says, the revolution is behind us. Object of consumption and sometimes of enjoyment. But what is in front of us and what will be terrible doesn't yet have a name. And what is coming? What is in front of us? This is the question which obviously comes after this kind of a crypto-messianic or crypto-politic apocalyptic moment of the revolution or of the failed revolution. What comes after the event strikes? So this is a very interesting question because we live in a moment, I would say, of a general implosion, which is just the structural antinomy of this kind of explosive moment of the revolution. And that's a very interesting reflection around this, let's say, experience, melancholic experience that becomes a dominant trend of perception of what comes to us or what is in front of us, or what comes next. And here, I'll just tell you very shortly the story of some of the famous situationists after 68. So, first of all, I mentioned yesterday that there was a very important important series of splits within the situationist movements. But one of the, let's say, one of the splits, or it's not really a split, but it's rather a separation, was between the two authors of the famous treatise on the misery in the student environment, which was one of the, let's say, ideological texts of the 68 events. And these two authors were Guy Debord and Mustafa Khayati, who is much less known than Guy Debord. And I'll try to tell you why. So what happened, there is a lot to be said about what happened after 68, of course, but let me tell you about the end of Guy Debord, who, you might know, committed suicide in 94. And of course, it is a tragic event, which was in a way, the logical ending of a very depressive period in Debord's life. But nevertheless, it was also a period of creation in which Guy Debord even produced his last work just before his death, which was never published, but which is an extra or never never published, but which was in a way an extremely dark oeuvre called His Art and His Times, Son Art et Son Temps. And so Guy Debord's suicide, of course, caused turmoil in leftist and especially artistic circles, and there were a lot of mythical sort of almost conspiracy theories around. So one of the hypotheses was that Guy Debord's suicide was a revolutionary act, which I find striking, because I don't know in which sense suicide can be a revolutionary act unless it is related to some sort of a revolutionary or revolutionary struggle, or even worse, or without qualification, terrorist activities. And parallel to these events, or much earlier, but in structural parallel, let me remind you that in Japan, there is a similar dynamics, sort of a political and artistic dynamics among the leaders of the failed, so to say, revolution of the so-called Shinjuku events in 1669, when that end up with, the attempted coup by Ieyasu, by Yukio Mishima, sorry, by Yukio Mishima, and which in a way ends, as you know, with the suicide of Mishima. And this is, sort of say, breaking all revolutionary potential in Japan for decades. So this kind of a attempted failed right-wing coup of Mishima, who was earlier one of the, let's say, leaders of the emancipatory movement in Japan. But let me come back to the Situationists where I introduced this kind of opposition between, let's say, explosion and implosion, or the implosion of Debord ending with his suicide, and the decision of Mustafa Kayati, who at some point announced to Guy Debord that he was going to quit the Situationist International, for the simple reason because he decided to join the revolutionary struggle in colonial context. Mustafa Kayati is by origin Tunisian, but I think he went to the Middle East and joined the revolutionary struggle. So that's quite a different, you see, quite a split, quite parallel possibilities between, let's say, the implosion and the explosion, between kind of a overcoming art from inside, going to a kind of political reality and political action, radical political action, revolutionary political action in this case. And on the other side, the tragic end by suicide, which by some is considered as a revolutionary act. And so basically, this is just a typology that I'm introducing here, because what is striking to me is not that much that Guy Debord ended up in a tragic way his days, but what is striking for me is the way this act could be interpreted by some of leading philosophers or artists today, because you know that in the last decades, the Situationist practices have a major influence on ideas of political art through Bourriaud's relational aesthetics, where situations are common reference to Le Comité Invisible, the group Tikkun, influenced by the Italian philosopher Giorgio Agamben. And so to me, it's a very controversial appropriation of the figure of, or of the practices of Situationism. And I would like to introduce here a critical point precisely connected to this form of emancipatory discourse, which sees this sort of a melancholic implosion as a sort of a paradigm of resistance, which I find extremely problematic. And here I would introduce a figure which doesn't belong to contemporary visual arts, but belongs to the 19th century literature. And this is a figure that you all know because it was used abundantly or abused by many of the great philosophers of the last decades. And this is the figure of Bartleby, of the scribe Bartleby by Herman Melville. And you might know that this figure was introduced and used by philosophers like Maurice Blanchot, that I quoted, by Gilles Deleuze, by recently Giorgio Agamben as well. And what happens with this kind of use of Agamben is quite, of Bartleby, of the figure of Bartleby is quite striking in this philosophical work, because somehow it becomes the paradigmatic figure of resistance, even of political resistance. So, for instance, in the case of Blanchot and Agamben, the weak power of Bartleby, who is the author of the famous phrase, "I would prefer not to," and perhaps for those who haven't read Bartleby, I should say that this is a figure of a very kind of a weird figure from Wall Street, by the way. The subtitle of Melville's story is a Wall Street story, who is working as a scribe of a lawyer, and who at some point decides to not commit to his duties, refuses to do whatsoever. "I would prefer not to," and he ends up in the following way. I'll quote Herman Melville's text. "Strangely huddled at the base of the wall, his knees drawn up and lying on his side, his head touching the cold stones, I saw the wasted Bartleby, but nothing stirred. I paused, then went close up to him, stooped over, and saw that his dim eyes were open. Otherwise, he seemed profoundly sleeping." So basically, at the end, Bartleby apparently dies out of starvation because he even stopped eating. And to me, this is obviously some sort of a weird fiction about the new bourgeois capitalist world. It's about Wall Street, even though it's Wall Street in mid-19th century. And it is striking that someone like Agamben would see sort of a weak messianic power, the power of interrupting the function of power. So to the potential to, so to say, cancel or interrupt or seize the instituted power. And therefore, in this messianic power of Bartleby, who died out of starvation, we see a sort of emancipatory potential. And I wanted the one that I missed to mention among the philosophers who instrumentalized the figure of Bartleby is nobody else but the kind of one of the let's say the outspoken kind of public philosophers today, who is compatriot of Boyanas, this is Slavoj Žižek, who during the Occupy Wall Street movement also introduced Bartleby as a figure of the Occupy movement. So basically, Bartleby again was saw as a sort of a revolutionary figure. And I just want to leave this like that, because in my philosophical work, I've tried to show that what I called messianic ontologies or ontologies of potentiality, on which precisely concepts this instrumentalization of the figure of Bartleby is based, are truly problematic. Because if we believe that the only resistance is coming through this kind of a melancholic implosion, then I don't see any hope for transformation of whatsoever. And precisely in this kind of a typological drive that I introduce here as a sort of experimental tool rather than a real articulated proposal, I would like to introduce sort of a counterpart of another type of artistic practice. And I reflected a lot around the artists that I would like to introduce here, precisely those that I described as the obsessed ones. So to the figure of the melancholy, I would like to pose the figure of the obsession, or perhaps of a possession. And while reflecting and through our also exchange with Bojana, I decided to introduce not that obvious figures that would come to mind as, for instance, Mustafa Kayati, or someone that was genuinely, let's say, a political maker, someone that went for instance, for a revolutionary struggle, but two artists that seemingly are not inscribed in any political process, that stayed a little bit like a reclusive artists and sort of slightly marginalized in their late life. And these are two women who, both of them, lived almost 90 or almost 100 years. And these are one English-born Mexican artist and one Russian composer. Before I tell the name of these two women, I would like to perhaps share my screen in order to show you a short interview of the English-born Mexican artist that you all know. It's just a 1-minute video. It's quite a fascinating part of an interview that I want to share with you. I'm sorry, I'm just looking for it.
What do you want to know? I don't know. Whatever you want to say. I think this is more. I would think that this is more.
I'm sorry, because it just moved. Because I have. Oh yeah. Here.
Are they guarding him? I don't know. That's ridiculous.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to show.
He said, which is a secret. It's a secret. You know what he said about you? Oh. That you're the only woman painter alive when he said it. That's ridiculous. And what are these little animals here? What do you see? What do you see? Like, well, small animals, like guardians or something like that. Are they guarding him? I don't know. Well, would you say? Well, I don't really think in terms of explanation. No. Yeah. I see terms of vision. For painting. Yeah. Am I right in saying that? Yes. that it's not surreal, it's not unreal.
Yeah.
It's just a different reality.
Yeah.
¿Te puedo encender el cigarro?
Yo prefiero hacerlo.
Ok.
Sí. ¿Qué más? Nadie puede con el tiempo. Nadie.
Okay, so you might have guessed this was Leonardo Carrington, one of the most original.
Asociar a
I'm sorry, I need to stop it.
calificativo de una biblioteca viva. Una biblioteca viva supone, entre otras cosas.
So this was Leonardo Carrington, who passed away only, I think, 10 years ago at the age of almost 100. And she never stopped working. She was an artist who was associated at some point in her life with the Surrealist movement. Her partner for some time was Max Ernst, and by the way, Bojana's reference, private reference, recently reminded me of Leonardo Carrington because we were talking about Max Ernst, and that's why I decided to introduce her work. I find this kind of obsessive work, which she never stopped until her late years, in which she's repeating more or less the same motifs, which are very close to Mayan magic, to Mexican kind of traditions, etc., etc. And by the way, she had this kind of moment of psychiatric kind of institutionalization during the Second World War, when Ernst succeeded to flee Europe and she remained blocked in Spain, etc., etc. So in a way, there are also some sort of a parallels that could be made with the late Antonin Artaud. But I just wanted to mention her work also because she was deeply convinced that her art cannot be recognized, cannot be institutionalized in any possible ways. And she was claiming that she was doing it for herself. And as you heard, she was resisting also sort of a discursive frame. She refused explanation, which is a very strong, of course, intuitivist pattern in many trends of contemporary art. And this is just an example that I'll leave open for discussion. And the other one, so this time I fortunately don't have to share my screen, but I'll play an audio file, very short, of Russian composer or Soviet composer. I'll tell you her name just after. So this was a piece composed in 1949 by a 30-year-old Soviet composer whose name is Galina Ustvolskaya, who is one of the legendary figures of the Soviet music, especially after the 80s, when she was discovered in the West. But what I wanted to propose here, I need to talk a lot about Ustvolskaya. I'm writing about her. She's one of the, let's say, she's a kind of a big inspiration for my work, and especially for my philosophical concept of persistence. But here, what I wanted to use as an example is precisely her power to persist in a certain art form that repeats from mid-20th century to her late life. She also passed away in the beginning of this century, like Leonardo Carrington. And she never made explicit references to politics. There were attempts to instrumentalize her art in political terms. For instance, she also had some sort of typically ideological Soviet like compositions for children, for pioneers, for instance, etc., which she somehow cancelled in her late period, although this is fantastic pieces of music. And then later on, when she was named by a famous Dutch critic, the lady with the hammer, this analogy of Nietzsche's philosopher with the hammer, I think it's quite a doubtful kind of designation, but nevertheless it succeeds to emphasize this kind of a striking use of clavier and of piano, and also of string instruments as a sort of batteries, as a sort of a drum. So there is this kind of really hammer-like power of her music that she decided to interpret in terms of spirituality, what she was calling non-religious spirituality. But what is completely erased from her story of the official biographical narrative of Wysocka is that, in fact, she took part in the siege or of defense of Leningrad during the World War II. And in fact, this is the piece called Octet, composed in 1949. By the way, I had the chance between the second pandemic wave to hear this in the Philharmonic in Berlin precisely a month ago, this piece, Octet, which is extremely powerful piece in which you almost hear kind of the rhythm of war, and at the same time of a sort of a persisting power of resistance. Because I don't have time, and I know that Boyan is with us, so I just want to stop here, and maybe in the discussion I'll talk a little bit more why I see these two artists as figures of not only obsession, because there was a lot of discourse around obsession in connection to their work. In case of, there is even a book on Wysocka called Composition as Obsession. She composed very little. She was claiming that she only composes when she hears a voice. You know, it's almost a mystical experience, but she says not religious, right? So this kind of a possession or obsession, almost witch-like sort of a drive, and which is, by the way, of course, not an accident, because we know that this kind of a figure of obsession, of possession of witches was also important feature of feminist discourses in the recent decades, for instance, in the work of Silvia Federici, etc. So I think that there is this kind of a sort of a witchcraft, sort of a power, obsessive power, that is a very powerful example, what I was describing yesterday as the immanent political power of artistic practice, which is not on referential level, which is not representative, which doesn't talk about art, and nevertheless, it has a genuine transformative power, therefore political power. So I think I'll stop here with my introductory statement rather than a talk, in order to leave the floor to Bojana and to join the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody's hearing me? Yes, okay.
Yes.
Can I start? Hello, hi Boyan. Hello. I'm sorry I'm late. I messed up the time. I was not aware that it's an hour before for me. So if you can just give me a kind of thumb up that I can start, then I will start, and that everything is okay. Then I will, yeah, okay. I suppose there are no protests, so I will just start.
Everything's okay.
Okay, good. This I want to know. A little bit of voice on the other side. Great. Thank you a lot. Sorry, Boyan, that I missed your start, but I think I catched quite a lot. So I'm very happy because I was really a bit in stress now, realizing that I am sitting in front of the computer, but actually everything is already happening. But that's the reality of our work at the moment. Thank you very much for listening. And I addressed my talk with a very broad questions, but it's really a little fragment of my current work. And I address it art, politics, and care. And maybe the subtitle could be a sentence from Mierle Laderman-Ukele's Manifesto, which we will also read a little bit today together. And then I will try to talk about it. After the revolution, who is going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning? And this question, after the revolution, who is going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning, is from the work of Mierle Laderman-Ukeles and her maintenance manifesto from 1968, which she wrote for the Queen's Museum, where she also had her first exhibition. And she wrote this manifesto from a very personal, situated position. She was an artist, but also a mother in a very precarious situation as a single mother. And of course, as every half person, she struggled to find time for herself. And so she also wrote this manifesto for Queen's Museum, which by my opinion, and I will try to read it here a little bit different as it was read many times, because I will try to read it as a kind of a very speculative political proposals, with which we can also deeply shift how do we address the politics of art. Now, for the ones who don't know her, because she is quite discussed in the last years, especially with the ecological turn and environmental discussions in art. Mierle Laderman-Ukeles is an American artist, mostly known for her work on different aspects of maintenance work, there are performances which she did in the very early work, like cleaning the floor of the museum, and then later she joined New York Sanitation Department, and she was actually a residence artist there, and she's still a residence artist there for many decades. So she has a very particular biography, a very particular place or position through which she always worked. And and when Boyan now was talking about obsession, I think that Mierle Laderman-Ukeles could be very easily connected to that notion in a very specific way. And this is also the way how she worked throughout her life. And now, of course, we can approach her work from many different angles and read it in a very direct way. We can say that it's a kind of a radical action art, a kind of a radical ready-made, a feminist ready-made, or as a feminist thematization of the homework and motherhood, which was mostly discussed, as it was mostly discussed, and then also as a performance where problematic positions of the woman artist are addressed, or as a disclosure of social relationality through the visibility of the work of reproduction, which is a kind of early example of relational art, which also how the work was discussed. But I think that all these interpretations somehow depoliticize her gesture and don't take actually her proposal seriously, either delegated to the originary male gesture of Duchamp. So there is a kind of specific genealogy, which is immediately problematic in her work, or to the expression of the political theme, which frames her position as a specific female problem, that either understand it as a kind of production of sociality or relationality, which was especially present in the contemporary art in the last decades. And I would propose to read this work as situated political and intimate intervention, which also radically reshift the ways how do we work and create art, and goes with hand in hand with artists working and living. And now I will try to share my screen, and maybe we can go a little bit through her work so that it will be more present. We'll try to do it now. So here is her manifesto. I don't know if you can see it. Can you, so here is her manifesto. And this is an original transcript of her manifesto, which was like 3 pages of typed material. And here you can also see her just a bit like one of the performances where she was cleaning the museum stairs. This was the series of performances in the beginning of the 70s. And here is from the later, just a little bit from the later work where she was, this is from her performance with the sanitation department, where she had a task to hold the hands of every sanitation worker in New York.
I think you have to change the window because we see only the index.
Okay, so I have to, just a moment, why? You didn't see anything till now?
We saw only the index,
Sorry. I don't know what is happening, yeah. Okay, so do you see it now?
Yes, perfect.
Super, good. So this is this is where she's cleaning the stairs. These are the early performances which she did. Okay, now it's stopped again. So I will first open the picture and then share it. Can you see it?
It's very small in the corner on the side.
That's really strange. Okay, I tried to make another method, stop share. And now I will do it again. Okay, now I will share it. Okay, now it's present, it should be.
Yes.
Okay, so this is from her performance in the 70s, in the late 70s, where she did this long-term work holding the hands of every sanitation worker in New York. And it is also a very important information that this residency of her actually started in the time where public services in New York really got privatized, and one of the first privatization and a very problematic restructuring was exactly the sanitation department. So this picture is from this. And now I will show you her maintenance manifesto, from which we will read some sentences and then I will try to explain further. So I will just open it. It's here. And share. Okay, so here is her maintenance art manifesto. And I will read from the point B. So there are several points in this manifesto, and this is also, she tries to explain several proposals of what for her maintenance art is. And then she's also explaining the work care, which it will be a kind of a first work she will also show in the museum. And she's explaining then the basic principles of that work. And I would like to point out specifically the part of the text on the point B, which is called Two Basic Systems, Development and Maintenance, the sore ball of every revolution. After the revolution, who is going to pick up the garbage on Monday morning? And then she continues, development, Pure individual creation, the new change, progress, advance, excitement, flight, or fleeing. Maintenance, keep the dust off the pure individual creation, preserve the new, sustain the change, protect progress, defend and prolong the advance, renew the excitement, repeat the flight. Show your work, show it again, keep the contemporary art museum groovy, keep the home fires burning, development systems are partial feedback system with major room for change, maintenance systems are direct feedback system with little room for change. And I will not continue with this manifesto because it's a very, very interesting read, and you can also access it on the internet and download and really read it carefully, because I think that many of these misinterpretation or a kind of framing her work into particular box were also not to take actually her manifesto seriously. And this I would like here to do, and then connect it with some thoughts like how we can actually think about the way how this proposition is also radically shifting the politics of art. Now, what is very interesting is that the principle of maintenance should not be simply understood as a kind of description of a female work, but more, if we would take it seriously, as a philosophical and aesthetic proposal, which directly intervenes into the production of art. So the work of art and its political articulation exist in some rather unusual gestures, which are all somehow paradoxical in their core. Or they rather seem as paradoxes because they result of totally different approach to very ontology of creation, from the care of life, vulnerability of our existence, and its utter interdependence. And this is not just interdependence among humans, but also among humans and beyond. Now, the work, as Mierle Laderman-Ukelens describes it in her manifesto, exists, as she said, in the keeping the dust of the individual creation, which of course point on the many problems of the continuous production of the new, and show the paradoxes of the new. This keeping off the dust of the individual creation is by itself a kind of oxymoron. And then she's saying that it exists in sustaining the change. So I would say that the change can actually appear. She is protecting the progress, which is an intentional, rhythmical, and processual paradox, and speaks about the need of balance. Defending the advance. So it's another temporal paradox. We can prolong the advance only if we slow it down, and renew the excitement, which means an effective shift of desires in the sense of renewal, repetition, and reciprocity. And the last, how she said that what is the principle of maintenance is to repeat the flight, which I read as a relationship between outside and inside, which is a relation of non-differentiation. And now if we read her manifesto in this way, this brings us into the core of the situated relational political thinking, which is also very much in the core of feminist political philosophy, which starts to think from and inside interdependency, not only ontological, but also interdependency of our life situations, expressions, and means of imagination. And art and politics here could be read as such interdependencies. It is a very difficult, different call than the classical call for politics in art, which we can often hear throughout the 20th century, and which we can find very well depicted in the classic German painting of Jörg Immendorf, "Where are you standing with your art, my colleague?" And I will show you now this picture so that you will have an idea of it. Just a moment. It's here. So this is the picture. Wo stehst du mit deinem Kunstkollege? And this picture is from 1973. And here you can clearly see like this kind of very, let's say, standard interpretation of an artist into the studio with all pop art, Neurealismus, concept art, land art, op art, all the possible articulation. And outside there are workers who are protesting, and somebody is entering inside the door and ask this very particular question. So what for me is interesting that what Miele Laderman-Jukeles proposes in Manifesto, and not just her, but many feminist artists also like Carla Lonzi later, or Hilke Zander, a German feminist filmmaker, is that they really radically shift this kind of idea of situatedness, where we don't have this very clear differentiation between field, the room, and the world outside, and so on, and the discussion about politics through the notion of autonomy, heteronomy, and a continuous, let's say, reflection of the borders and crossing of the borders. This is absolutely out of that discussion. And that's why also in the Maintenance Manifesto, we really have this kind of oxymoronic structure, that these words are actually put together, which are the opposite, but nevertheless, they are really working engagingly on our imagination. And I think this kind of thinking we need somehow, even desperately, if we would like to grasp the contemporary problems in between art and politics, especially in the relation to a general precarity of the art fields and artistic lives, and also lives in general, which are becoming even more visible with the current political, social, and also environmental crisis. And that's why in my title of this short talk, I added this notion of care to art and politics, to expand the thinking into a particular direction, and actually to think how to bring this ethical relationality back into the discussion on the art field, and how this non-normative situated ethics can be part of the art creation, how the politics of art can be thought after the revolution with all the garbage around and also inside us. And this is also currently part of my broader working process on the new book, studying how making of art and its politics are entangled with the current crisis of living, especially with the immense inequality and various forms of violence, where these questions are, of course, becoming extremely important to tackle them from this perspective. So I'm not so much busy with how art addresses politics or how it can have a potentiality to materially, but much more how it can materially articulate it, create entangled words, and maintain relationality between lives. These are the processes which are not necessarily originating from what can be seen in the art institutions also, but also to what is happening around us, how it is possible to live, and to which also the institutions own their own share. And for me, it was very interesting to listen to you, Boyan, now to bring these two artists, which I really appreciate very much, into the discussion, because both have a very, very specific biographical and institutional history. And it's very much corresponding also to that, what I'm saying, that I'm really thinking about these articulations, which are much more articulations really of specific words, which are not necessarily also connected to the networks of representability and current discussions or circulation of sharing. But much more to this, what you are naming obsession of life. And I would also connect it much more with that very interesting notion for me, maintenance. So it is very interesting from this perspective to observe the problem of precarity of artistic life and work, through which a lot of the politics is articulated today. Because nowadays, we often hear that the art field is a training ground for the precarious relationship. And of course, we can find this precarious relationship in every sphere of art, in the ways how art is organized, financed, in the modes of working, but also in the modes of living of artists. And it is part of the institutional relationship and aesthetic expressions, educational and cultural political processes. So vulnerability and insecurity are in the core of working, producing, and sharing processes. However, at the same time, even if the self-exploitation, flexibility, and insecurity are obvious, especially when observing the modes of working in the self-organized or more marginal sector, we cannot claim any special particularity of the art field in relation to the general social precarity. So those processes are in the core of many societal processes today, and art, as being part of those processes, is confronted with the exploitation and violence over the modes of subjectivity and their interdependency. And that's why I think that one way of how to think that would be, of course, with what German philosopher Isabelle Lorey names, that we are actually governed through precarity. We are governed through our vulnerability and flexibility. And that means also that our ontological interdependence, vulnerability, that we are ontologically precarious, vulnerable, and interdependent is the main biopolitical matter of governance. And that has some radical consequences for the subjectivities, because it's destroying the interdependencies, relationality, and political solidarity because of the fear of insecurity, measures of protection, and simply exhaustion. But paradoxically, on the other side, it is also accelerating the production, fragmenting and dispersing the operation at works inside this very difficult situation, forcing us to do and to protect us even more. And additionally, governance through precarity is not only related to our subjectivities, but also to the enhanced vulnerability of an environmental surrounding, atmospheres of our living and working, and environmental interdependencies, which are also standing in the core of the huge political inequality and processes of violence over the not only human lives. And this is why maybe all the propositions of Ukele seems to be such an oxymoron from today's perspective, verbally puzzling yet engaging, because only in this way, how she describes is this paradox, these paradoxes can be maintained and reciprocity can linger in balance. Now, we could of course claim that art field somehow in the last decades partially contributed its own share to the normalization of precarity, especially through the economies of the project work. And art was often critical about its institutional structures and economies, but at the same time was rarely examining its own economy and politics in the sense of the radical re-evaluation of the life of the artist and its ontological interdependence with the world, very rarely radically reimagining its own production. And in this sense, it would be reductive, by example, to perceive Mierle Laderman-Ukele's work as a feminist expression of the institutional critique, because this is not in her interest, and this is also seen in her later life when she joins the New York Sanitation Department as an artist in residency in the moment of its crisis as a public service and general privatization. Now, as there does not exist only one art world, so there is also not a precarity which would be having the same consequences for everyone. And I would even say that the glamour of engaged project and productivity of the artist in the global sphere, mostly global West, which continuously address the current political and social issues of our time, actually covers and does a lot of damage to the existing micro-political differences between multiple and differentiated artistic worlds, where precarity has also radically different consequences for the rethinking and rearranging the relations between art, politics, and life. Its situationality is a crucial part of its imaginative strength and potentiality of creation. What I mean by example is that we have to differentiate when we speak about production of art between different precarious conditions and precarious contexts, because the generalization of precarity can also easily overlook the differences in the particular art context, and again connecting them to one global economy. So it does not approach the art worlds as contradictory, deeply disproportionate, and often disturbingly unequal, with very different living and working conditions, political anxieties, and embodied traces of vulnerability and power dynamics. These proportions can be related to gender, class, race, economic situation, health, geographic location, etc. And what I mean with that is also that when we go back and really think through Mierle Laderman-Ukele's work, when we take her proposition seriously, philosophically seriously, like what does she say about maintenance? What kind of implications has that for ontology, for temporality, for spatiality? then it is actually too narrow to describe her intervention as a kind of a feminist intervention into the sphere of reproduction, bringing private sphere of women into the art and so on, because this kind of discourse can easily generalize, but the discourse which Mierle Laderman-Ukeles has in her manifesto is a kind of a speculative, almost philosophical proposition, which can have very different consequences in specific environments. And it can be in a very specific way also related to gender, class, race, economic situation when we think about the notion of maintenance. And I would just like to add another conceptual problem here, that the notion of maintenance, for me, it's also very interesting because it can be in a very interesting way related or kind of on the challenging the notion we are all using when we are describing our contemporary work, and this is management. And management is this kind of a generalized articulation, erasing differences, and actually really re-establishing the divisions according to a very particular power dynamics of gender, class, race, economic situations, and so on. And maintenance, on the other side, is something totally different. And I think this is a very interesting conceptual proposal, which I cannot develop here so much, but it's something what I am very busy with still on a very conceptual level at the moment. Now, we mostly discussed these problems which are coming inside, like topics of art, like, by example, addressing the issues of gender or addressing the issues of inequality, thematizing them, caring about them. But rarely we are caring with, inventing how to entangle with the modes of living and working, and exploring how it is possible to create, imagine, invent modes of living, and how it is possible to entangle multiplicities of work and invent ways of recognizing and caring about differences. So in that sense, art field has all the symptoms of contemporary world: inequality, power dynamics, the problem of growth and continuous development. And in this sense, the politics has to become much more situated that it can become deeply entangled with the situation of working, speaking, and imagining. And here, feminist approaches or decolonial processes are very good examples to shift the relationality of politics, which cannot be thought outside the situated ethical relationality. Because such relationality opens as another inhabiting of the world, which deeply relates the politics with the question of equality, existence, and survival, with the invention of the body and poetic imagination, which would bring this interdependence on many different levels also into the core of our experience. And maybe here I will stop because I see that we are already very long. I still wanted to add something, but this I can also bring then later in the workshops, which is very much also connected to a specific situation of how to deal with this precarious situation in a very specific situation of political shifts we are experiencing today, where the body actually again come into a core of political discussion, but that is maybe something what we can then do later when we will meet together in the workshop. But for now, maybe that's enough for the discussion and for opening up. Thank you very much.
So I'm not sure what is now the protocol, so I will just jump in the discussion first of all to say hi to Bojana.
Hi, Boyan. Long time no see.
Yes, but it's incredible because let's not make the private public, which is part of this kind of a tendency that we are discussing. But it's so interesting that I introduced a little bit our prehistory, that for 20 years we are like the sort of a Bojana team that we have been discussing from Vienna to London, Paris to Ljubljana, and then Frankfurt to Berlin. But it's so interesting that we haven't seen each other for a few years, and now we again are engaging with the same period. They are almost the same cartography of concepts. So that's to me is really kind of a very stimulating, Bojana, and great to see you. So I spontaneously joined by first of all, saying that it's fantastic that you chose precisely this kind of entrance in the problem of the posteriority of revolution, because also this was my point, as if we take the kind of revolutionary moment as a sort of a paradigm of this kind of intersection of art and politics, then there is this problem with what I have described and criticized in my philosophical work earlier as a messianic logic, or kind of like a logic of the event. So there is this kind of a tendency to think of this kind of a revolutionary moment as the big seizure of the institutionalized regimes of power, etc., and inequalities, etc., etc. But then what comes after? I mean, if the high modernity utopias are all failed, and it's also a big issue, how to reinflame imagination, how to reinflame certain visions, as Leonardo Carrington was saying, I see visuals, I see visions, I don't talk about, reference. So how to reinflame our imagination of the future. And I think we, first of all, should once for all end with this kind of a logic of event. So this kind of a fixation, maybe melancholic, maybe obsessive, maybe traumatic, with the failed event of revolution, and really to think practices which might be revolutionary but micro-political, that might be proliferating, that might be complex, that might be imaginative. And I think what your example is absolutely brilliant proposal in precisely that direction. And here to open the discussion, I'm of course not moderating, so it's just spontaneous between us. I was just wondering, I mean, it's just a comment. And this is a point that we have in common for many years, and we have developing parallel texts. But you were, I think, absolutely right to emphasize our friend Isabelle Rai's point on the institutionalization of precarity in the artistic field. And I've been describing this kind of a tendency of like the shift from institutional critique to institutionalization of critique, right? Mm-hmm. Because I think in parallel to the institutionalization of precarity, sort of the imposition of structural mechanisms that are demanding from especially young artists to be putting themselves in continuity at risk, which is also an existential risk, without being heroic or revolutionary whatsoever, but just to put themselves to the limit of exhaustion. We know all that, right? And at the same time, we have a parallel mechanism, but kind of a inverted upside down, which is the mechanism which I would describe as a not institutionalization, but rather as stabilization of the critical discourse. And what I mean is that, for instance, one of the participants of the closed seminar last evening, and you meet in a while this fantastic group, was I think was very right to emphasize the pressure that she was saying that young artists feel pressure to be political. What does it mean? So that's institutional pressure to be political, while at the same time we see the pressure to be precarious. So this kind of a oxymoron or sort of a paradox, I think, is very important to tackle also in this discussion. Maybe only to start with, or to open the.
This is a very interesting point, Boyan, what you are making, like this pressure to be political. I think it's really telling us a lot also how politics, the way how the politics or the political articulation is institutionalized through precarity is absolutely not just disembodied, but asituational. This is exactly not a situational politics, because what does it mean, pressure to be political? And this is for me very interesting. That's why, but I think it comes from a precarity, because precarity is a very specific mechanisms which actually really sucks out this interdependency and related actually to a mean of protection. And there is a specific immunity, and I think the pressure to be political is part of that. Like, how do we actually, it's a very paradoxical mechanisms that with being political, we are immunized ourselves on not actually to be attached in a very paradoxical way to this world. And then the political always comes, and this is a very big problem of contemporary discussion between art and politics, it's a question of positions. And it is still, and I think it comes also with this, what you are saying, with still this kind of fascination with the event. No? And I was starting to think about that also. This I also thought maybe we can discuss more in the workshop, because I would also like to get to know more the participants and so on. But of course, this notion of rethinking comes also from a very difficult situation, not in a, let's say, still a kind of a welfare and okay situation in the European art cities and so on, but from the situations where there is really this very radical shift also in a political sphere, like with the populism, authoritarianism, and so on. And I was actually thinking, what is happening on that field there? Like in which way actually politics of the ones who are on the progressive side is articulated. And I think that the debate goes in a totally wrong direction, because it is a debate of, how to say, still an intervention, producing an event and so on. But what is actually happening from behind, it's a general erasure and destruction of living forms and formulations. And this is not touched. And this is, I think, something what is very important for me. So I think it's a very important point what you are making. And this pressure to be political, I think it goes really in every direction. For me, that's why I'm also analyzing now a lot this use of more, how to say, ethical or relational notions of art, which are now very present and very dangerous, like care. The care is the most important one, but also vulnerability, because these are like a kind of affective notions around which artists are also organizing, the festivals are made, and so on. And of course, the question is, why are they so present? They are, of course, present because we all have this existential need. We all see that something is wrong. But on the other side, they are also present because they are fantastic machines of generalization. So they are covering the differences. So we are all somehow, of course, we are caring. But what does it actually imply? And this is something what I think Merle Laderman-Ukeles does in such a good way also to just open up this very daily materiality or paradoxical materiality of care, which is a totally different articulation. So I think for me, this is also very interesting that we have all this kind of almost like an optimist politics inside art societies and so on. But this optimism is a kind of very destructive on the other side, because it's actually not taking into the consideration that a lot of people are speaking from very different positions. And this precarity is really, it has very different and absolute, much more radical consequences, maybe for some than for the others. And this is something for me what is extremely interesting to tackle. And maybe with that, we can then really start to think in a different way also about the institutional questions and so on, and not like who is outside, who is inside, how to intervene, and so on and so on. I don't know if I answer, but I was just trying to think along with you in this way now.
No, thank you. I completely agree, Bojana. It was not even a question; it was rather meant expanding your point. Mm-hmm. And I think it's fantastic what you called simplification. No, the word was not
generalization, or yeah.
Yes, and I wanted to add that it is also simplification, because we see. And it was fantastic that you introduced this opposition between maintenance and management. And I think this is extremely important, because nowadays we also see, and it is much broader than the artistic field, of course, and the cultural field. It's a trend of a sort of economic kind of production and symbolic exchange, which is precisely the imposed, if not forced, forms, prefabricated forms of self-management. So we face sort of a imposition or demand to enter certain kind of standards or performative forms of managing our lives. And I think this is extremely valid for contemporary artists. And it's, in a way, art or field of culture become a field of symptoms, or a field of a field of, let's say, experimentation for all these trends. And I'm not the first, of course, to say this from Boltanski and Chiapello to nowadays. There were a lot of statements in that line. So I think this is something that we can also take into account. And furthermore, I just wanted to say, because you open also this question of, let's say, of assimilation of or appropriation of former emancipatory forms, which in fact this kind of institutionalization, symbolic or discursive institutionalization of emancipatory forms, which became standards, sort of, or kind of normative horizon, they start really destabilizing or really affecting the forms of existence, genuine forms of existence. And just to give an example, it's so striking that, because we were speaking of this logic of the event, and in fact, let's think of these forms which appeared in late 50s or mostly in the 60s, like, which were called, I mean, like the artists were still looking for a language at that time. Events, happenings, actions, performances, right? And nowadays, all this kind of a vocabulary is completely co-opted by instrument of symbolic value production, which is kind of hegemonic, normative, and restrictive. So that's, I think this is quite interesting. I mean, of course, I've written on the appropriation of the concept of collaboration, and this was related to your invitation in Frankfurt a few years ago, like how collaborative term is kind of at stake in not only performing arts, but in arts as such, because it is very much related to what you call project logic. These are certain economic rationality, which is forced which is imposed to especially young artists in order to establish sort of a precarious collective economy. And then there is the pseudo-ethical validating or legitimizing discourse behind that. This is about community building, this is about relations, etc., which I think is a new avatar of what Sloterdijk was calling cynical reason. I mean, I was not the right person to quote here, but I like this.
But, you know, I was now thinking, because you also talked a lot, which I found really interesting, about this problem of melancholy. And then you put the obsession on the other side. And I was thinking then, how actually, if we would really think care in a kind of non-normative way, how care is never melancholic, because it cannot afford to be melancholic. But there is another way, which I was now thinking, how melancholy also comes back. And I will give you one example, because that really reminded me a lot on some examples I'm very busy with to analyze now. And this is from Slovenia. There was there is a kind of a big political shift in the last years. Maybe you heard about it, and it's a kind of huge urban ghost sweeping over. Also cultural politics. And there are two female artists. I will just talk about one. Simona Semenic is one of the most interesting experimental playwrights at the moment in Slovenia, a young playwright who really does, it's really a crazy invention of forms and expressions and so on, how she works. And of course, she also has a very radical, let's say, radical relation to life, in the sense of celebrating its multiplicities, differentiations, and so on and so on. And she got the main artistic reward last year. But when she got the main artistic state reward last year, and when she got this reward, right-wing medias were publishing the photos she did with another Slovenian artist, Janez Janša, where she was posing pregnant and her belly was looking through a cut Slovenian flag. So, and you cannot imagine the attacks she got from the right wing. And of course, there was a real cultural war, but I think that the argumentation of both sides were very problematic. This is where I want to come. So on the one side, you have this kind of conservative, authoritarian, populist, classical instrumentary. She is not Slovenian. She has to be punished. This is a woman. It's of course, there were a lot of misogyny and so on. On the other side, you have this, how to say, event understanding of politics. She did an intervention, she did an affirmation of politics and so on. And I think this does actually a lot of destruction on both sides to the forms of existence in general, from the left and from the right. So like on one side, forms of existence are almost commodified. So of course, they are discussed almost like a commodified identities and so on. On the other side, they would just like to be erased and put out of the discourse. And I think that this is something very interesting for me to observe. How is this possible also in a political public sphere to push with other, how to say, articulations of politics? Like, where is the language? Which kind of language to use? What does it come when we really take seriously what does it happen when we really take seriously what Ukele said, and we try to really re-articulate also the notions and language differently? Because I think this is really the main problem. Like, how do you actually fight back on that populist pressure? And you cannot fight back with the same forms of appropriation, which would just like to squeeze a little bit of value out of all those life forms. That does not work. And this is for me something I was just thinking like, so what I wanted to say now is that there is a lot of melancholy in the articulation of political on the side of the left when it is actually attacking the authoritarian arguments. And this melancholy does not work, because this is not the problem. And this is something for me very interesting now with this melancholical aspect to think about, like how it's, what is actually this formulation? How can we formulate also the political demands in a different way? Yeah, this is the point which I want to brought inside.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a very great also example that you make. By the way, I haven't heard about this scandal. I wonder who of the Janez was this.
Janez Emil.
It was, yes, he's usually involved in this kind of.
It was actually very simple. The photo was even from his performance. So it was not really it was a performance where you have different scores and you can do what you want with the flag. And it's actually, maybe I have it here, just a moment. I can show you. You cannot see it. Huh?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So this is her. And this is this photo, which was, but it's just one of the scandals. There are many. And very interesting is that all these scandals are mostly related to women. They are mostly related to the body. And that question is also for me then very important. What is happening that the body is in such a center? And it's just not a question of progressive and conservatives. This is total simplification, I think. This is the problem of this discussion.
Yeah. Absolutely, I understand. Yesterday in this kind of more pedagogical format, what I tried to do was to propose some quite maybe simplistic, but also clear typology, or attempted kind of a preliminary typology of the connection between art and politics, because and very philosophical and formalized through, let's say, aspects of substance, predicates, modality, etc., etc. But what I think, why I did that? Because I think we need certain clarity around precisely the very concept of art and politics that we are using in order to discuss this relationship. And precisely in this sense, I was trying to think of art and politics, like the connection between art and politics in different ways. So one would be precisely this kind of a referential level or representative level where art is obviously and directly dealing with political matter. But another possibility would be to think of sort of a immanent political value of artistic doing, of artistic practice, which is not necessarily claiming political effects. And that's what I wanted to bring with this concept of obsession. But my horizon was, I didn't have time to do that, to deconstruct this position between melancholy an obsession at the end. Because, for instance, you know, in the Renaissance, where this concept of melancholy becomes very important through Dürer and Cranach and the humanist writers, Ficino, etc., there is this kind of interesting concept of melancholia fumosa. This is the sort of ardent melancholy, which is for them the topic of the, not the topic, but the power of genius. So, of course, let's go away of the concept of genius for now, but I think it's very interesting how to inflame melancholy in order to make it productive, to make it come back at work or at stake. I see that, Marina, maybe it's
I don't want to interrupt you. I would love to continue listening, but we have a question from our audience. It's a question from Swimming Pool, Sofia, the art space swimming pool, and she asks, how do you both use the word radical?
It's a very good question. Yeah, for me, it's very much connected with a kind of a root problem. And roots are very rhizomatic. So it's not just that, because radical, it's coming from the roots. No? And it's very much connected with a kind of, there is something in the floor which goes wrong when we talk about radical. And this is a very interesting question, but the floor can be manipulated in a very different ways. They can be thrown over our feet and we lose the ground. And this is maybe the event, I don't know. But they can also be approached in a very botanical way, that they are actually, that there is, everything is living inside. And this is the radicality in which I think. So it's much more botanical, like how the roots are spreading and connecting. And of course, there are a lot of conflictual situations also in the floor. And it's not this kind of pulling it up so that you lose the floor. And I would connect this with this, what we talked with the event. For me, it's really like you almost throw it out of the floor and then you cannot stand. It's a kind of this kind of Badiou, and you are in between and you don't know what will come or what actually happened. But I think like this kind of more botanical idea of radical can help us to talk about the radicality in a kind of really complexify the relationality. For me, this is the radicality and not something like a cut or something like that. So that's from my perspective.
I'll just add a few words. I guess this is Victoria Draganova who is asking this question. And in fact, we were dealing precisely with these issues last night. And what I call radical, of course, I use it rather as a historical reference because the notion or the concept of this kind of idea of radicality was obviously becoming a legitimatory tool of the high modernity radical artistic movements, which were highly politicized. I mean, classical avant-gardes, what we call now classical avant-gardes. And obviously this idea stayed as idea of a kind of radical emancipatory practices.
Yeah.
But the interesting trend is that in the last decades, somehow it becomes also a euphemism of, let's say, extreme right. So when we hear in media all over Europe, especially in France, I can say, when you speak the radicals, it's a sort of euphemism of fascists or of extreme right. And I think this is a kind of a slippery discursive ground, because now radical, and I think this question is really important, because when we speak of extremists or radicals, so we start implying right wing. And this is something which is also very interesting as I don't have time to expand in this direction here. I've written about this mostly in French, like what I call fascist double bind, that everybody is like this kind of a mirror, mimetic relation of right and left wing accusing each other of being fascist. And maybe this is a little bit what happened also in the Slovenian scandal. And I think we need really new political but also artistic vocabulary, new critical vocabulary. By the way, Mustafa Kayati that I quoted, he was the author of something very interesting in this classical, let's say, a situationist era. He tried to make a situationist dictionary. I think he was influenced by Georges Bataille. I don't have also to talk about it. But this is really at stake. We need a new vocabulary. Because radicality that's true, it's a risky term, and I completely agree with Bojana that we should maybe go back to this kind of a botanic reference, but at the same time there is this kind of media or kind of commonsensical instrumentalization of this concept that I think is quite problematic. And this is quite related to this kind of, I think, melancholic or whatever, this discredit of the idea of revolution or idea of radical change, of a radical transformation.
Yeah, it's full of affects, no?
Mm-hmm.
Which starts to work immediately. Hello.
Hello also from me, and I'm turning myself on because I also wanted to ask a question, which maybe to get the discussion closer to the exhibition in Sofia, which is actually the primary occasion of this discussion. The exhibition includes artworks created in the past 100 years. So the whole time we are thinking of the topic art and politics in a historical terms. But I'm more interested in the swift, in the change of the notion of the relation between art and politics in the past couple of years, maybe 10 to 20 years. First, because of political changes, but also because of technological changes and what we are observing in the past years of changing the notion of truth and talking already of post-truth, half-truth, and so on. And yesterday with Boyan, you actually talked a lot about the relation between art, politics, and their referencing to truth. So my question is, how did this relation between art and politics change in the past years, especially when talking about new technologies, fake news, and post-truth?
Mm. I think that there is a kind of, this will be a strange answer. I think that, by example, what became very clear with this post-truth and new technologies and so on is that, by example, the whole idea of political subversion or subversive affirmation does not work anymore. It's totally losing the ground. So, by example, I'm thinking about all the political interventions which would like to tackle political issues like Institute for Political Beauty in Germany or something like that, like activist actions and so on. There is a very problematic dynamic there at work, which I think it has something to do with using the same management, logistic and technology as everybody is using to get their message through. And this is really a problem. And of course, there are a lot of artists who are trying to somehow disturb that, but it's a very big problem, I think, for that kind of political art. And but there is also something else happening, which is a kind of almost like developing forms of protection or a kind of little micro-political worlds which are out of that mediatized discussions and are very much connected back with discovery of practices, embodied practices, therapeutic practices, healing, magical. This is in performance very present. And for me, this is a very, very interesting development. It can be, I think we are in a dangerous moment that it can be very easily appropriated as this generalized discussion, which would give us that we feel well. But there are some attempts where this is really shifted into technological field. And there is this huge field now, especially also in pandemic time, but also before, where a lot of artists and theoreticians from media arts, they start to talk about digital care and digital vulnerabilities and so on. So these discussions for me are very interesting because they are really having a totally different understanding to technology and so on. And this is something what I also try to examine a little bit, like where these big projects or artistic projects who are really taking all the mediatized forms to get the message through, to manipulate, to, like the 90s were full of them, but they are still going on. What is the problem in their relational ethics that they so much fail? And they really fail for me, and they are very problematic. Even if the message is going through and it is sparkling the political debate and so on, but the consequence is really like exactly what I say, for the forms of existence are destroying because they are very privileged. It's an elitist project, and yeah, So in that sense, I would see this. And I think that maybe this could be a way how to micropolitically actually address this, and what are these different digital networks of care which are existing, and they are there. And it's interesting that they are appearing inside the field of art mostly. Also, this is an interesting discussion for me.
Thank you very much, Bojana. I think we have to close here because, I mean, we could go on, and I think I'm really convinced that we have to continue with this discussion, because you opened so many really important aspects that I think we have to continue somehow. But in 10 minutes, Bojana, you will have your workshop. And so I think we have to stop here. Thank you very, very much, Bojana. I think it was extraordinary discussion, and we will have it online so people can watch it later. And thank you very much.